Hello, 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 and welcome to Happy, Healthy, Whole with Sharea. I am Sharea, and today we are talking generational trauma. I may break this into multiple videos. I'm not deciding yet. It's going to be based off of how long this gets. But I want to talk about generational trauma in the sense that first, I want to really say where this topic came from for myself. Um, so I've had the opportunity over the last few weeks to really be working with and talking with some different different individuals who identify as um, Black and or brown, depending on their ethnicity surrounding their journey. And so because I've had the opportunity to talk with them, I've heard a lot of stories that are about traumatic experiences and stressors that were not just that they're not only experiencing, but also their generations before them had experienced. So really when we think about generational trauma, it really is thinking about how some of the behaviors and some of the things that we are transferring to generation comes from the stressors from the one generation or multiple generations before. And so many types of trauma can be indirect or direct in terms of how we experience it. So for example, witnessing violence, living in violent communities, living in a constant level of threat or fear, these could all be examples of stuff that we were pre-exposed to or exposed to, as well as possibly the generation before us and or generations before us have also been experiencing. And really what happens is that there's a psychological trauma that can lead to physical and mental health problems that are going to land on the current generation, even though the generations before them may have had the actual exposure and types of different exposures. And so they can still, let me just add this, be dealing with or having traumatic experiences. However, with generational trauma, it just concurs that, or it just means that, or concludes that the generations before us also had experiences that were handed down to us both internally and or through actions that were unresolved around the trauma and the effects of that trauma. And so, for example, when we think about children who grew up in domestic violence, or we think about adults that might be raised by someone who has a mental illness and or depression, sometimes those forms of relationship or connection to those individuals then create a experience for the current generation to actually navigate those forms of trauma within their own life and or believe that some of the coping skills or skills that they use are appropriate because they've also been raised and or exposed to those forms of coping skills or strategies. And so I always, when I talk to my clients, I talk to them about, maybe looking at some movies or some other shows that can actually show this, and how even sometimes when it's not directly your family, because you're in a community and or existing within a community, you might also have some of that community or collective trauma that is being passed down generation to generation. And so I wanted to start with at least giving an explanation, giving a little bit of understanding around what generational trauma is. I think a lot of times when people are discussing it, they go into so many different elements, but it really does come down to just being aware that generational trauma is transferred from experiences or stressors from one generation to the next, right? And so I stress that word experience and stressors because those are how we create our indirect or direct coping strategies or things that may actually be handed down without us actually saying that's what we're doing, right? So it's how we may raise our children. It's how we may have intergenerational poverty. It might be how we have uh, other community effects or impacts that could actually be impacting us as a current child or product of those before us who may have been exposed to different forms of violence. So I'm going to do what causes generational trauma in this same video. And then maybe what I'll do in the next video is some tips. So maybe this will just be split into two. So really, what causes generational trauma? There are a lot of things. So let's think historical oppression, violence within communities that may not have had power and or the dynamic of power to be able to protect themselves. And so really using the example of Black Americans who have been enslaved in this country, they may experience generational trauma connected to the brutality that happened to the generation before them, or even generate two generations before them, where they were forced to live in unbearable conditions, inhumane conditions, and separated from their families as if this was a normal process. And so really what happens is that these forms of brutality and connection to historical enslavement behaviors can also then be passed down in terms of the responses and and internal responses around threat and fear and an inability to hold power that says that this may not happen to me, but also building in distrust that something at any point can happen to me based off of the historical oppression that my culture or my family and those connected to my identity may have experienced. So really when we think about what causes it is oppression, right? And I use the example of Black Americans who are enslaved, but we can also do that for gay and lesbian experiences that may have been violent and or violently historically how people may oppress and or discriminate against those individuals, and then how ultimately as a result it's handed down that if I identify with this particular identity, there might be the possibility that I could be harmed or hurt, and it automatically breeds this level of threat or fear inside of me that I have because the reality of the historical oppression or violence that has happened against me. Right. So that's one thing to consider. Other thing to consider is intergenerational poverty. When we think about generational trauma, the impact of poverty or the difficulty around living in circumstances where you can't thrive physically, emotionally, or mentally, and financially can lead to a level of disconnect around adequate or disconnect around understanding the importance of adequate education, adequate resources, and healthcare. And ultimately, because those things are a part of what you are being raised in or forced to experience, you believe that I'm doing the best I can. This is me trying my hardest to get out of those environmental impacts. But the reality is that there are still some impacts that are actually being held down, handed down to you, whether you like it or not, that may impact how you see your ability to thrive mentally, physically, and emotionally. Another one is thinking about it from the perspective of, we talked earlier about with the example of the enslaved of an enslaved person understanding the separation from their family or the detachment from their families, but we can also think about cultural dislocation where you are no longer connected or a part of what you identify as your homeland or your culture, and due to that there's a conflict of connection and generational connection to those who might be in your identity. And so what happens is there's this level of loss or feeling of loss that is being held down because or passed down because it resembles and or shows that you have a level of disconnect to your identity based off of your homeland and your identity based off of your immigration or integration into what might be your current location. So this can be not just say from the Black American perspective, but this can be from the immigrant experience here in the US where I might be first generation or second generation, and some of that emotional detachment or loss that I experienced, that my parents experienced or grandparents experienced, related to having to relocate for safety, relocate for economic opportunity, still may be being passed down to me around loss and isolation. And so really thinking about it from the perspective that there are some things that don't need to be discussed that are still being passed down within your community that is impacting even how you're navigating trauma. And the importance of this is that you not only know what it means, but also where it comes from. And some other effects or other things to think about in terms of our identity is intersectionality, because then when we put on top of not just the racism, sexism, or homophobia that people may have experienced or generations may have experienced, but being able to see how my intersects of those identities are then impact around the generational trauma that I might be experiencing and or exposed to is very significant in what we might think about related to how we will thrive as a current individual with those identities. And so I hope that makes sense. Just to give a real quick wrap up, the definition is things that are for generational trauma is really transferring trauma and trauma experiences and the way we may even cope with those experiences from one generation to the next. And then ultimately, some of the ways that it is caused is through, not some of, mostly the ways that it's caused is through oppression, cultural dislocation, intergenerational poverty, and other factors that might be related to our intersectionality and our identities that can fall under oppressed communities. And so I hope that makes sense. Next week, what we're going to try to talk about is maybe the signs and symptoms or the signs of generational trauma. And then I'll give tips in that same video. So we'll wrap this on up in two. All right, be well.